Welcome to the Drawing Room Detectives, where mystery lives and logic reigns. In this original Hercule Poirot tale, the great detective and his loyal friend Captain Hastings visit a quiet English village for a charming clock festival, only to discover a death sealed behind a locked door, a mysterious gear clutched in the victim's hand, and a cipher that spans centuries. Prepare for secrets, sabotage, and a legacy encoded in time itself. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And if you love classic whodunits, be sure to subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss a case. Chapter 1. The Ticking Village. It was one of those rare spring mornings in England where the sky, free of cloud and gloom, offered just enough sunshine to inspire hope, but not quite enough to trust it. We were on the early train to Wessex, rattling through greening countryside, as Poirot examined his gloves for invisible specks of dust, and I peered over a small map of the village of Netherdene. "To think," I said, folding the paper with some satisfaction, "a quiet weekend, no murderers, no foreign diplomats with shady pasts, just you, me, and the horology festival. What could possibly go wrong?" Poirot gave me one of his looks, amused, indulgent, and perhaps just a little wary. "My dear Hastings, when you say such things you tempt fate, but I admit a festival of clocks is a charming diversion, precision, order, symmetry. What more could the little grey cells ask for?" It was his idea, of course. A letter from an old acquaintance at Scotland Yard had mentioned the village of Netherdene and its annual celebration of horological craftsmanship. That, combined with a curious legend of a hidden cipher left behind by an eccentric 17th-century clockmaker, had stirred Poirot's interest like a spoon in a teacup. By noon we arrived at the village station, no more than a platform with a crooked wooden sign, and were met with a breeze heavy with the scent of lilacs and brass polish. Netherdene was as picturesque as any postcard: stone cottages, ivy-covered fences, and narrow lanes that curled like clock springs. Bunting in shades of gold and burgundy fluttered overhead, each bearing the image of an old-fashioned pocket watch. A large banner stretched across the main square read, "Welcome to the 43rd Annual Horology Festival." "This," Poirot said with a sniff of approval, "is civilized." We strolled through the fair with the easy leisure of two men who had every intention of doing nothing strenuous. Stalls lined the cobbled square, selling miniature hourglasses, polished pocket watches, cuckoo clocks, and antique timepieces of every variety. The ticking was everywhere, layered and overlapping, like a chorus of well-trained insects. At one stall, a tall man with a rather extraordinary moustache of his own attempted to sell us a clock shaped like a peacock. Poirot, of course, scoffed at the asymmetry. At another, a local boy demonstrated a gear mechanism that could wind itself with minimal movement. Poirot raised an eyebrow, nodded with approval, and made a small note in his little black notebook. It was near the old church, beneath the tower whose face bore a blackened Roman numeral dial, that we met Mr. Edwin Mallory. He was a slight, grey-haired gentleman with narrow spectacles and hands so delicate that they looked better suited to lace-making than mechanics. His stall, modest but elegant, featured half a dozen exquisite clocks, all finely carved, with visible inner workings encased in crystal. He greeted Poirot with a polite nod. "You must be the gentleman from London," he said. "The constable mentioned your interest in old horological codes." Poirot smiled modestly. "You flatter me, monsieur. I am merely an admirer of fine workmanship and of legends. They say the clockmaker Nathaniel Quince hid a cipher in one of his masterpieces, a riddle of gears and teeth. Mallory's expression shifted, just a flicker of something behind the polite mask. A gleam in the eye, perhaps? Amusement? No, something closer to caution. Quince was a genius, he said slowly, and mad as a hare. People have hunted that cipher for centuries. It's said the man died in debt, trying to protect something no one could find. Yet you believe it exists? He chuckled. Belief, Monsieur Poirot, is a dangerous fuel. It drives men to brilliance, or to ruin. Poirot tilted his head. And which do you think you are closer to, Monsieur Mallory? The old man offered no answer, but instead reached into a drawer beneath his stall and produced a small, perfectly ticking mantel clock made of rosewood and brass. I found this just last week, hidden in the attic of a demolished estate in Warwickshire. 17th century craftsmanship, unmarked. But inside, well, let's just say it's unusual. I leaned forward, but Mallory gently shut the drawer before we could inspect it further. I'll say no more, he added. Not here. Too many ears, too many eyes. Perhaps tomorrow, if you visit my workshop. Poirot bowed politely. Then we shall look forward to it, monsieur. We walked away, the sound of ticking growing fainter behind us. I say, I muttered. He was rather cagey, wasn't he? Poirot didn't answer right away. He stopped near a clock shaped like a cathedral and examined its hands with interest. Hastings, he said softly, sometimes the man who speaks in riddles is the one who has already solved the puzzle, but we must be quick. Quick about what? He smiled. About resting. For tomorrow, I believe, the quiet village of Nether Dean will no longer be so quiet. Chapter 2. The Locked Workshop. It was some time shortly after 8 when the village square was shaken from its usual calm by a high-pitched shriek. At first, I mistook it for one of the local girls startled by a bee or a toppled clock, but the moment I saw Poirot set down his cup of hot chocolate with sudden precision, I knew something far more grave had occurred. "Come, Hastings," he said, rising. "That, I fear, was no cry of delight at a discounted cuckoo clock." We followed the sound down a narrow lane behind the square, where a modest two-story workshop stood, with its shutters drawn and the sign Mallory and Son, Horological Specialists, hanging slightly askew. A small crowd had already begun to gather outside the entrance. Vera Mallory stood pale and trembling, her hand clamped tightly over her mouth. Next to her, the village constable, a square-shouldered young man, was attempting to look composed. Poirot exchanged a glance with the constable, who looked uncomfortable. "We broke the side window," the man admitted, shifting his weight. "Didn't want to, but Miss Mallory insisted. We climbed through and found him, slumped over the bench. Not breathing. We stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of oil, metal, and something less definable, an undercurrent of disuse or finality. The interior was dim but meticulously organized. Gears, tools, and clock faces lined the walls in symmetrical perfection. A half-disassembled grandfather clock stood in the far corner like a patient under surgery. Edwin Mallory sat hunched over his workbench, motionless. One arm dangled at his side, the other clenched against the table, as if reaching for something. Poirot moved to the body with a solemn quiet, kneeling to examine it with clinical delicacy. He did not touch the corpse. Poirot never disturbed what he could read intact. After a moment, he stood and looked at the constable. "Notify the local physician and seal the premises. Until we are certain of the manner of death, nothing must be removed." He turned to me then, voice low. There are no marks of struggle, no bruises, no disarray in the room. This was not a violent intrusion. But suicide? I asked. He gave me a look. The workshop was locked from the inside, no open windows. Yet I find the position of the body artificial, as though placed carefully. And then there is this. Poirot leaned forward slightly and indicated the old man's clenched right fist. With delicate care he pried it open. Inside lay a small brass gear, no larger than a coin but oddly ornate. Its teeth were irregularly notched, and etched across its surface was a curious symbol, a sort of triangle pierced with a vertical line, surrounded by looping arcs like the arms of a compass. "Well," I said, peering closer, "that's rather unusual, isn't it?" Poirot nodded, eyes narrowing. "Indeed, mon ami, it is not a piece from any ordinary clock. This gear, it is symbolic, placed intentionally, perhaps even meant to be found." Vera Mallory, who had edged her way inside, spoke in a hoarse whisper. "I've never seen it before. My father never mentioned anything like that. He worked late last night, said he was close to something but wouldn't explain. He'd been so secretive of late." Poirot offered her a gentle smile. "Your father? Was he troubled?" She hesitated. He'd been restless, obsessive even, always talking about Nathaniel Quince, the cipher. He claimed he'd found the final piece, but no one believed him. "Except perhaps someone who wanted it for themselves," Poirot murmured. Before she could answer, a familiar voice rang out from the front of the shop. "Well, well, if it isn't our favourite foreigner with a flair for corpses." I turned in surprise. Standing in the doorway, fedora in hand and trench coat flapping, was Inspector Japp, looking not the least bit pleased to be summoned to a village full of ticking clocks. "Japp," I said. That was quick. "That Poirot insisted I come at once," the inspector replied, eyeing the scene grimly. And when he insists, well, one learns not to argue. Though I confess I'd hoped for something more substantial than an old man at his workbench and a peculiar cogwheel. Poirot raised a hand. "Mon ami, you are too hasty. The clock may be old, but the crime, I fear, is newly wound." Japp sighed. "Let me guess. You think this little gear is some kind of clue?" "I do." He held out his hand for it. Poirot, ever reluctant to part with a potential key to the mystery, placed it in Japp's palm with delicate reluctance. "Looks like scrap metal to me," Japp muttered. "Still, if it keeps you busy and out of the yard's hair, I'll humour you." Poirot's eyes glittered, but he said nothing. Instead, he moved toward the bench and examined the tools, the unmarked notepad by Mallory's elbow, and a curious burn mark on the wooden surface, barely noticeable unless one was looking. Then he turned to me. "Hastings," he said softly, "this is no ordinary workshop, and this is no ordinary death. The great clock has begun to chime, but the hour it will strike we have yet to know." Chapter 3, Gears and Grudges. The village of Netherdean, for all its idyllic charm, had turned rather frosty in the aftermath of Mallory's death. The warm smiles of stallholders and curious tourists from the day before had vanished like steam off a kettle. In their place came whispers, low and urgent, like the ticking of clocks out of sync. People spoke in corners now, casting glances at Mallory's shuttered workshop with a mixture of awe and unease. Poirot, of course, had no time for speculation. He had already made a list, 2, in fact, and had begun visiting the names written neatly in his pocket notebook, each line annotated with cryptic symbols and flourishes only he understood. "Time," he said, as we crossed the square that morning, "is not the same for everyone, mon ami. For some it passes. For others it is pursued." Our first stop was Cecil Blythe's workshop, a stone's throw from Mallory's, though one could be forgiven for assuming it had been abandoned. The paint had peeled, the front window was fogged with dust, and a sign reading Blythe and Company, established 1872, hung at a crooked slant. Inside, however, came the gentle grind and wheeze of gears, like a clock breathing its last. We stepped in to find a tall, lean man bent over a table. His hair was wild, a shade lighter than smoke, and his hands, though deft, trembled ever so slightly as he adjusted a set of miniature winding tools. "You're him," Blythe said without looking up. "The Belgian." Poirot gave a modest nod. "Hercule Poirot at your service, and this is my associate, Captain Hastings." Poirot stepped lightly between the dusty cabinets. "It is said, Mr. Blythe, that you and Mr. Mallory had once been partners?" Blythe gave a short, sharp laugh. "Once, long ago, before he fancied himself the heir to Nathaniel Quince's legacy." "You do not believe in the cipher, then?" "Oh, I believe in it all right. And so did he. We both did. Once. Drew us in like a flame does a moth. But Edwin, he became different. Secretive, possessive." "Possessive?" I asked. "He stole things, Captain, not just clocks, clients, ideas. I had an original mechanism, my design, mind you, meant to emulate the precision of a celestial clock. Weeks later, he unveiled something suspiciously similar at a London auction, claimed it as his own." Poirot leaned in. "Did you confront him? Did you—" "I tried." He played the innocent, of course. Oh, he was always polite, smiling, courteous. But underneath, he was always watching, waiting. He didn't want the cipher because he believed in the mystery. He wanted it so no one else could have it. "You sound as though you still cared deeply for the legend," Poirot observed. Blythe's hand hovered over a cracked gear, then lowered. "I still do. But dreams won't pay the bills. I've given up the chase." Poirot tilted his head. "And if Edwin had not?" "Then perhaps that's why he's dead." There was something final in that tone. Poirot thanked him, leaving a silence in the room that ticked louder than the clocks. Back outside, we headed toward the inn where Vera Mallory had taken refuge. As we crossed the square, I ventured. He certainly didn't mince words. No Hastings, nor did he lie, but the truth, comme toujours, is in the omissions. We found Miss Mallory seated by the hearth in the sitting-room, a cup of untouched tea cooling beside her. She had changed into a black wool dress and wore no veil, no jewellery, nothing but a single silver pin shaped like a star tucked against her collar. "Miss Mallory," Poirot began gently, "I must ask again about your father's recent preoccupations. You said yesterday he was obsessed." She gave a nod, small, automatic. "He barely slept. If he wasn't repairing clocks, he was digging through journals and ledgers, most of them older than this village, always muttering about Quince, about a pattern. I didn't understand half of it." "You did not share his enthusiasm. I stopped trying to understand years ago. He never really saw me, Monsieur Poirot, not unless I was carrying a gear or a cup of tea." I shifted uneasily. There was no bitterness in her tone, only the kind of distance one sees in people who have grown used to being dismissed. Poirot studied her. "Yet you stayed. You remained in the house. The business. I took care of the finances, the appointments, the rent. Father kept the dreams, I kept the doors open. It was the arrangement. Did he ever speak of Cecil Blythe? Vera's lip curled ever so slightly. Only to mock him, he said Blythe had no sense of refinement. A man who can't balance a pendulum shouldn't chase a cipher. His words. And the cipher? Did he believe he had truly found it? She paused for a long moment. Yes, she said finally. Or rather, he believed he'd found the first piece. He came home 3 nights ago, pale as a ghost. Wouldn't stop talking about teeth counts, rotation degrees, a signature hidden in steel. He wouldn't let me near his notes. Poirot steeled his fingers. Merci, mademoiselle. One last question. Did your father have any enemies? She gave a mirthless smile. Only everyone who knew him well. Chapter 4. The Apprentice's Lie. Timothy Farrow was exactly the sort of young man I might have once considered promising, if not for the perpetual twitch in his left eye and the distinct impression that he always had one foot out the door. When we found him that afternoon hunched beside the fountain in Nether Dean's churchyard, he looked positively haunted. He was no more than 22 or 3, with a mess of dark hair and thin, ink-stained fingers. His boots were scuffed, his collar slightly askew, and he fidgeted constantly with a brass ring that hung from a chain around his neck. Poirot approached with the usual blend of gentility and unmistakable scrutiny. "Monsieur Farrow, I hope you do not mind that we speak with you." The boy gave a stiff nod. "I figured you'd come round eventually. Everyone else has." He motioned for us to sit beside him on the stone bench. Poirot, however, remained standing, his hands folded neatly over his cane. "You were Mr. Mallory's apprentice?" 4 years, nearly. Started out polishing cases, ended up working the mainsprings. He said I had the hands for it. "You were fond of him?" Timothy's mouth twitched. "I respected him. He was brilliant, obsessive, but brilliant. Could identify a misaligned gear by the sound alone. But the last few months, he'd changed." "In what way?" Timothy rubbed the back of his neck. "More paranoid. Always checking the locks. Wouldn't let me near some of the old clocks. Kept them covered, sealed up. Started whispering to himself. Talked about Quince's cipher like it was real. Said he'd found the key. I didn't believe him, not really. Thought it was just another one of his fixations." Poirot nodded, as if this matched his expectations. "And on the night of his death? What time did you leave the workshop?" "Just after 6, Timothy said, eyes darting upward. "He said he wanted to be alone to finish something. I cleaned the workbench, locked up the back storeroom, and went home. That's the truth." Poirot tilted his head. "You are sure you left nothing behind?" "No, sir, nothing." And with that, we left him, still fiddling nervously with his ring. Poirot said nothing as we walked back toward the workshop, his gaze distant. "You believe him?" I asked. Poirot gave a non-committal grunt. "I believe he told us the truth, as far as he dared. We had arranged with Inspector Japp to have access to the workshop for a short time before the coroner's removal of the body. It had been cordoned off, of course, and the constable on duty allowed us in only after a brief lecture on contamination. Not that Poirot ever disturbed a crime scene. He observed it the way a mathematician studies an equation. I, on the other hand, have never quite mastered the art of keeping my hands in my pockets. As Poirot examined Mallory's notebook again, I idly ran my fingers along the edge of the workbench, the one where the body had been found. A splinter caught my skin, and I drew back with a muttered oath. "Careful, Hastings," Poirot murmured without turning. But something else caught my eye. A fragment of fabric no more than an inch wide caught on a jagged nail beneath the edge of the bench. It was dark blue and frayed as if from hurried movement. "Poirot," I said, holding it up. He turned at once, his eyes narrowing. "Très bien, mon ami. Très bien." He examined the fabric carefully, then looked back toward the apprentice's seat in the corner. He said he left at 6, but this was torn from a coat, perhaps a cuff, dragged against the underside of the workbench. "Hastings, what was Mr. Farrow wearing today?" I thought for a moment. A navy wool jacket, threadbare at the sleeves. Precisely. He turned away, speaking half to himself. Why lie to conceal what? Did he return after 6? Did he see something or do something? We searched the bench more thoroughly. Beneath it, tucked between a coil of copper wire and a discarded chisel, Poirot discovered a small square of folded paper. It bore no writing, only a crude diagram. Circles within circles, a triangle at the center, and 3 gears sketched with notations in an untidy scrawl. "He returned," Poirot said softly. "He saw this, or placed it. Either way, it explains his unease." "You think he's involved?" I asked. Poirot straightened, slipping the paper into a protective sleeve. "I think, Hastings, that young Monsieur Farrow knows more than he has told us, and he is not the only one." He moved toward the workshop door, his tone suddenly brisk. "Come, there is someone else I must speak to, a woman with an attic and perhaps a ghost of the past." I blinked. "A ghost?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Figurative, mon ami, for now." Chapter 5, The Cipher's Ghost. Miss Agnes Dobbins was precisely the sort of English spinster who seemed born to guard village secrets. She lived in a lopsided Tudor cottage at the edge of Nether Dean, surrounded by wild roses, overgrown hedges, and an alarming number of wind chimes that tinkled like whispers on the wind. The townsfolk referred to her as eccentric but harmless, the kind of phrase which, in Poirot's experience, often concealed a far sharper intellect than people realized. We found her in her parlour surrounded by musty books and delicate teacups, a grey cat draped like a stole over the arm of her wing-back chair. She rose at once and extended a hand to Poirot with something that might have been a curtsy. "I heard you were looking into poor Edwin's death," she said, in a voice both soft and conspiratorial. "About time someone did." Poirot bowed. "Indeed, mademoiselle, we have learned he was quite taken with the legend of Nathaniel Quince. I understand you share a similar interest?" She smiled. "Quince is my passion project. Clockmaker, cryptographer, alleged lunatic. Depends who you ask. The man built not just timepieces but puzzles, hidden levers, false faces, codes hidden in chiming sequences, quite ahead of his time. And you own one of his clocks?" "Well, perhaps. It's never been verified, but Edwin was convinced. It's been in my attic since my grandfather's day. I showed it to him once, years ago. He offered me nearly £200 for it, but I refused." "Why?" She looked embarrassed for a moment. "Because I hadn't finished studying it." Poirot gave a delighted chuckle. "You are a woman after my own heart. Might we see it?" 10 minutes later, Hastings and I found ourselves in an attic that smelled of mothballs, cedarwood, and old secrets. Beneath a dust cloth stood the clock, tall, narrow, and peculiar in its asymmetry. Where the dial should have had Roman numerals, there were symbols, triangles, loops, even a spiral, and the hands were fashioned like serpents, their tails coiled around the central spindle. Poirot inspected the face first, then the base, then the interior, opening the back panel with a click. Inside were the usual weights and gears, but one element drew his attention instantly. "There," he said, pointing. Nestled behind the chime hammer was a brass gear, identical in shape and size to the one Mallory had clutched in his hand. It bore the same etched triangle and arc symbol, though this one was even more intricately notched. Poirot retrieved it carefully with a handkerchief. Miss Dobbins gasped softly. "That was not there before, at least not the last time I looked." "No," Poirot murmured. "I suspect your Mr. Mallory paid this clock a second visit. He must have hidden the gear here for safekeeping. Or perhaps it was here all along, and only recently discovered." I frowned. "But what is it? Why would someone go to such lengths to hide a gear?" Poirot turned it over in his hands. "Because, Hastings, this is not simply a gear, it is a key, part of a larger mechanism, one hidden across multiple clocks, scattered over time and distance." He turned back to Miss Dobbins. "Mademoiselle, may I ask, do you know of any other clocks built by Quince or his pupils still in circulation?" She considered. "A few, yes. Edwin kept a list, said he'd tracked down 5, sold 2, kept 1. The others were in private hands, a collector in Kent, another in Yorkshire. He was obsessed with finding them all." Poirot nodded slowly. He believed the cipher required assembly, that the message was not in the clocks themselves but in the parts, gears, teeth counts, perhaps even the positioning of symbols. I tried to imagine it, a code scattered like breadcrumbs in clocks across the country, waiting to be collected and reassembled. Poirot wrapped the gear in a clean cloth and placed it in his inner coat pocket with great care. "We must find the rest," he said, "and we must do so before someone else does." "Someone else?" I asked. He gave me a pointed look. "Hastings, you found a scrap of fabric beneath the workbench, and now we find this gear carefully hidden. Someone else knew what Mallory had discovered, someone who may have followed him, or worked alongside him, or even—" He did not finish the thought, but I could see it in his eyes. Someone who had killed him for it. Chapter 6. Clocks Without Hands. The following day dawned cool and overcast, a proper detective sky, as Poirot called it, which I found rather gloomy. The village square, so lively just 2 days ago, now bore the hush of suspicion. Locals whispered behind curtained windows and avoided our gaze as we passed, which Poirot took as a promising sign. "When people become silent," he said, "they have either something to hide or something to fear." That morning, with Inspector Japp's cooperation and the late Mr. Mallory's appointment ledger in hand, we began what Poirot termed our clock hunt. The names were few, but the implications were enormous. Mallory had sold 3 clocks in recent months, each one, we suspected, potentially hiding a piece of the cipher. The first, an elaborately carved mantelpiece clock, was found in the sitting room of a retired solicitor named Mr. Barrington, who lived just outside the village. The clock was handsome but unremarkable, at least until Poirot, with the delicate precision of a surgeon, removed its backplate and tapped lightly along the frame. "There," he murmured, pointing to a shallow hollow behind the chime coil. Inside, wrapped in a bit of oilcloth, was another gear, brass, finely etched, identical to the one found with Mallory's body. "Another piece," I said, breath catching slightly. "Oui, Hastings, and like the others, it has teeth, 21 to be precise. See here, this notch, slightly deeper than the others. They are not uniform, they are part of a code." We visited 2 more homes. In the second, the clock's pendulum was missing entirely, and in the third, a tall case clock passed down through 3 generations, the inner mechanisms had been tampered with. Poirot found faint scratches around the screws, and inside the chime weights had been replaced with lead replicas. "Someone has already been here," he said grimly. "They found what they were looking for, and removed it." Back at the inn, we gathered our findings around a table in the common room. Jap joined us with a pint and a furrowed brow. "This whole thing's madness," he said. "You're telling me Mallory scattered parts of a cipher into 6 antique clocks and thought no one would notice?" "Not madness, mon ami," Poirot replied. "Genius. He was obsessed with time, was he not? So he hid his code in timepieces, functional riddles." "And now what?" Jap asked. "You think someone else is trying to collect them all?" "I am certain of it," Poirot said. Vera Mallory arrived just then, her black coat buttoned tight despite the warmth of the fire. "I need to speak with you," she said to Poirot, bypassing the rest of us entirely. We followed her out into the garden, where she lit a cigarette with trembling fingers. "My father kept a journal," she said quietly. "Not his public one, the one he carried in his waistcoat. I found it hidden in his mattress this morning. It's all there, sketches of gears, maps, lists of owners. He believed the cipher wasn't just a historical puzzle, it was a confession, a message from Nathaniel Quince himself." "A confession?" Poirot repeated. "He wrote that Quince wasn't just a clockmaker, he was involved in blackmail. He used the gears to encode names, locations, payments. That's what Father thought the final cipher would reveal. The ledger of a criminal disguised as a craftsman." Poirot's eyes lit with interest. "And your father wished to expose this?" "No," she said coldly. "He wanted to own it. He believed it would make his name immortal." She crushed the cigarette beneath her heel. "But I think someone else wanted it more." We returned to the workshop for a final check before dusk. As I trailed behind Poirot, I noticed something odd. One of the clocks on the far wall, a silent brass-cased relic with no hands. "Hello," I said. "I don't remember seeing this one before." Poirot turned, inspected the face, and narrowed his eyes. "Clocks without hands do not tell time," he said, softly. "They wait." "For what?" He gave the faintest smile. "For the right person to turn the key." He opened the case, revealing a mechanism jammed at a strange angle. Within the frame, barely visible in the gloom, was another diagram, etched directly into the wood. Triangles, arrows, teeth. "The cipher," he whispered, "or at least its blueprint." Then he straightened. "There is no time to waste, Hastings. We must find the remaining pieces before the killer does, for I fear they are already ahead of us." Chapter 7. The Rivals Workshop. If ever there were a building that looked like it had given up trying, it was Cecil Blythe's workshop. The place sat sullenly at the edge of the square, its paint peeling like old wallpaper, its windows fogged with the breath of 100 forgotten clocks. Even the sign over the door, Blythe & Co., hung at a slant, as though embarrassed to still be in business. "It has character," I said feebly. Poirot sniffed. "It has neglect." Inside it was quieter than I remembered. The ticking of clocks, so central to any horologist's domain, was almost entirely absent. Only 1 or 2 wall clocks clung to life with the weary persistence of veterans. Cecil Blythe stood behind the work table in the centre of the room, tinkering with a small carriage clock. His face was pale beneath the flickering gas lamp, his eyes heavier than before. When he saw us, he didn't look surprised. "I suppose you've come to ask more questions," he said without looking up. Just one or two, said Poirot. You were once close with Edwin Mallory, n'est-ce pas? Blythe gave a hollow laugh. Close enough to know when to stay out of his way. You've spoken to Vera, I assume, and Farrow. I expect they painted me as a jealous rival. Poirot's moustache twitched. Monsieur Blythe, it is not my concern how others paint you. It is how you frame yourself that interests me. Blythe hesitated, then motioned toward the back room. Come, there's something you should see. We followed him through a narrow passage to a small, dim office. The walls were lined with dusty shelves, books stacked haphazardly, and in the far corner sat a large roll-top desk, closed. Blythe took a key from his pocket and turned it in the lock. I stopped chasing the cipher years ago, he said, as he pulled the desk open. But I didn't stop watching Mallory. I knew he'd never let it go. And I knew it would destroy him. He pulled out a worn leather journal from the bottom drawer and placed it gently in front of Poirot. His notes? Poirot asked. No, Blythe said. Mine. Poirot opened it delicately, turning the pages with the reverence of a man reading a sacred text. Inside were diagrams, dozens of them, of gears, interlocking mechanisms, symbolic engravings and names. Many names, some we recognized, Agnes Dobbins, Mr. Barrington, but others were unfamiliar. The journal included maps, lists of serial numbers, even notes on the alloy compositions of specific clock parts. You were documenting the pieces, Poirot said softly. Blythe nodded. Edwin wasn't the only one looking. I just lost the stomach for it when I realized where it would lead. And where is that? Blythe leaned back against the desk, crossing his arms. Obsession, theft, madness, maybe even murder. You don't spend years chasing a legend without it changing you. Edwin wanted to find Quince's cipher so he could claim the glory, but I know, he found something else, something dangerous. Did he confide in you? Not in words, but I saw it in his face that last week, like he'd finally won, only he looked terrified. Poirot tapped a page in the journal. You kept this secret from the police. Would you have given it to them? Blythe asked. They'd lock it in evidence and forget it ever existed. You, on the other hand, you'll finish it. I don't know why I believe that, but I do. Poirot closed the journal gently. Merci, Monsieur Blythe. You are not quite the man you pretend to be. Blythe gave a tired shrug. Don't let the clutter fool you. I know exactly what time it is. As we left the workshop, the rain had started, light at first, but insistent. Poirot pulled his coat tight, glancing back toward the old shop front. What do you think? I asked. He's holding back, Poirot said. But not to protect himself. Vera? No, someone else, someone unexpected, perhaps even someone he still loves. Do you think he killed Mallory? Poirot paused, then shook his head. No, Blythe is not a killer, but he is afraid, and that, mon ami, is nearly as dangerous. We stepped into the grey light, and as we did, Poirot removed his notebook and jotted a single word beneath a list of names. Merchant. Then, we are missing one piece, he said quietly. Chapter 8. The Final Gear. By the following morning, Poirot had fallen into one of his intense silences, a state I had learned not to interrupt. He sat by the inn's window with his coffee cooling at his elbow, notebook open, and a row of the recovered cipher gears laid out before him on a silk handkerchief like delicate coins. Each glinted gold bronze in the morning light, their etched symbols forming a curious, incomplete pattern. 5 pieces. And the 6th, still missing. I feel, I said cautiously, as though we've gone around the whole countryside. No, Hastings, he said without looking up. There is still one direction we have not travelled, sideways. I frowned. Come again? Poirot tapped the page of his notebook with one slender finger. 3 clocks Mallory sold. 1 remained in his workshop. 1 hidden in Miss Dobbins's attic, and 1, just 1, was not recorded in his ledger. And how do you know that? Because the receipt is missing, he said, sliding a folded slip of yellowed paper across the table. This I found tucked between the pages of Mallory's private journal, dated just last month. No name, no address, only a time, 10:47, and the words, traded, not sold. Just then, Japp burst into the room, rain dripping from his coat and his boots leaving wet prints on the polished floorboards. "You're not going to believe who just rolled into Nether Dane," he announced, breathless. "A travelling merchant, claims to deal in old curios and timepieces, parked his van just outside the church." Poirot rose instantly. "Ah, voilà, the sideways step. We found the merchant near the graveyard, hunched beside a faded green van covered in rust and stickers from every town in England. His name was Arnold Strake, and he looked like a man who had lived one too many lives, sallow cheeks, dark gloves, and a twitchy smile that never quite reached his eyes. "I'm not in trouble, am I?" he asked, the moment Poirot introduced himself. "Not at all," said Poirot smoothly. "We are merely interested in your wares." Strake gestured toward the back of his van. "Clocks, mostly, from estates, auctions, that sort of thing. I'm a regular at Mallory's shop. He traded me a piece just a few weeks back. Odd one, too. Wouldn't tell me why he wanted my broken lantern clock in exchange." "May we see it?" Poirot asked. Strake hesitated, then pulled aside a canvas drape. Inside the van, 6 clocks were strapped to the shelves, but one stood out immediately. A square-bodied table clock with tarnished brass fittings and no visible maker's mark. Its hands were missing. Its face was etched with peculiar lines, and the rear panel had been unscrewed. Poirot lifted it carefully, turning it over. "Empty," I noted. "Not entirely," he murmured. Using his small tweezers, Poirot withdrew a curled bit of parchment that had been tucked beneath the chime bell. Unfolding it revealed a rough sketch, gears arranged in a wheel, arrows showing rotation directions, each piece labelled with a tiny letter and number. Then he turned back to the clock and reached beneath the false base. There, cleverly wedged into a groove, was the final gear. It looked like the others, brass, etched, finely notched, but this one bore a distinct marking, a series of dots arranged like constellations. Poirot's eyes lit with triumph. 6 gears, he said softly. 6 steps of the cipher. Strake looked confused. "It's just a gear, isn't it?" "No, monsieur, it is a map." Back at the inn, Poirot laid the 6 gears in a circle. Each one's teeth had been etched at unique intervals, the symbols aligned to a central axis. He rotated them with delicate precision, aligning the markings in such a way that a pattern emerged, an interlocking star within a circle, pointing in 6 directions. Then he unfolded the diagram recovered from Mallory's desk and compared the two. "A code in rotations," he whispered. "The number of teeth between each symbol. It corresponds to time. Each gear a direction, a position. And they all point here." He tapped the page. I leaned in. "Mallory's grandfather clock," I said. Poirot nodded. Built by Quince himself, passed down through the family. The cipher ends where it began. Within the hour, we were inside the Mallory home. Vera watched silently as Poirot approached the grand clock in the hallway, a towering beast of dark mahogany, its brass pendulum still, its dial frozen at 10:47. He opened the rear panel and reached inside, feeling along the inner frame. There was a faint click, and then a compartment slid open near the base. Inside was a small, leather-bound ledger. Poirot lifted it with care. The pages were brittle, filled with tight, angular script, names, dates, payments, notations in cipher. Each page a web of connections, dealings across counties, threats disguised as invoices, and phrases like CB silence guaranteed, 7.321. "It's not just history," I said. "It's blackmail." Poirot nodded solemnly. "Mallory found it. Perhaps he wished to profit, or to burn it. But someone else wanted it too, someone who would kill for it." He turned toward Vera. "Miss Mallory, I believe we are now ready for the hour of truth." Chapter 9. The Hour of Truth. We gathered in the parlour of the Mallory home just before dusk. The grandfather clock loomed in the corner like a witness, its brass hand still frozen at 10:47. Its secret exposed, but its presence somehow more ominous now. Poirot, composed as ever, stood before the fireplace. To his right sat Inspector Japp, arms crossed and brow furrowed. I took my place beside the hearth, notebook ready, though I barely needed it. Every detail was etched into my mind. The guests arrived one by one. Vera Mallory, stiff-backed and pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Timothy Farrow, nervously tugging at his sleeves, eyes flitting around the room. Cecil Blythe, weary but calm, his gaze fixed squarely on Poirot. And finally, Arnold Strake, the travelling merchant, who lingered near the doorway like a man considering his exit. Poirot cleared his throat. "Mes amis, thank you for coming. You may be wondering why I have summoned you here. It is very simple. The cipher has been broken, the final piece recovered, and with it the motive for murder has come into sharp focus." No one moved. Poirot continued. "Let us consider the facts. Edwin Mallory died in his locked workshop. In his hand, a gear etched with a peculiar symbol. To many this would seem meaningless, but we now know it was part of a greater whole, a cipher embedded in timepieces created by Nathaniel Quince, the enigmatic clockmaker." He gestured to the 6 gears laid out on the side table, now arranged in their final formation. Vera's eyes flicked to them briefly, but she said nothing. These gears, recovered from various clocks, form a map, both literal and figurative. They led us here, to this house, to this clock, and to this. He held up the small, aged ledger, its pages now marked with evidence tags. "A ledger of blackmail," said Japp grimly. "Dozens of names, some still alive, some already dead." "Oui," Poirot agreed. "A record of secrets, transactions, threats, even sabotage. Mr. Mallory uncovered it piece by piece, driven by his obsession. But someone else was driven by something far more dangerous." He turned to Timothy Farrow. "Monsieur Farrow, you lied to us. You said you left at 6 the night before the murder, yet a scrap of your jacket was found caught beneath the bench near Mallory's body." Timothy blanched. I panicked. I came back later, yes, but I didn't kill him." "You returned to confront him?" Poirot said gently. "You discovered the truth. Perhaps he even showed you the cipher. But you ran." Farrow nodded miserably. He was raving. talking about making history, about no one else being worthy. I got scared. But you were not alone, Poirot continued, his gaze shifting slowly, deliberately, toward Vera. Mademoiselle Mallory, he said softly. You remained calm throughout, dutiful, but cold, too cold. Your father was dead, and yet, no grief, only resignation. I knew it would happen, she said finally, voice tight. Not murder, just that he'd destroy everything. Poirot nodded. You saw the signs, the missing funds, the ledger. His obsession with the cipher had driven him to steal from his own accounts, perhaps from yours as well? Her eyes flickered. All of it, she whispered. My mother's inheritance, gone, on gears and ancient clocks. You confronted him, Poirot said, stepping closer. You asked him to stop, but he refused. And when Pharaoh fled that night, shaken and confused, you stayed behind. Vera was silent. You argued, Poirot continued. He refused to destroy the ledger, refused to admit what he'd become, and in a moment of fury, perhaps even fear, you struck him. Still, she said nothing, but her hands had begun to tremble. Poirot reached into his coat and withdrew the small brass gear Mallory had been clutching in death. You did not plan it, mademoiselle. You saw the gear fall. You placed it in his hand, knowing it would confuse matters, knowing it would seem part of his work. Then you locked the door from the inside. Mallory's workshop had a hidden bolt near the floor. You knew it well. Her eyes filled, but her jaw remained clenched. He ruined everything, she said. Not just the money. Our name. Our future. He wanted glory, and he dragged us into madness. Poirot's voice softened. Yet even in murder, you preserved his legacy. You told no one about the cipher. You wanted it buried. Vera closed her eyes. I just wanted it all to stop. Japp stood, signalling to the constable waiting outside. Vera Mallory, you are under arrest for the murder of Edwin Mallory. As she was led away, the room remained still. Cecil Blythe rubbed a hand across his face. Pharaoh sank into a chair, head in his hands. Only Strake remained still, eyes wide with the realization that he had, quite literally, carted a piece of murder evidence across the country. Poirot walked to the grandfather clock and adjusted the minute hand gently. It clicked into place. 10:48. There, he said softly. Time moves on. Chapter 10. The Rhythm of Justice. The sun rose slowly over Nether Dean the next morning, as if uncertain whether the village had yet earned its reprieve. The horology festival had been quietly cancelled, the bunting taken down, the laughter silenced. All that remained was the steady, sombre tick of clocks behind shuttered windows, less celebratory now, more funereal. Poirot and I sat once more at our usual table by the inn's fireplace. He had returned to his eggs with renewed appetite, though his manner remained reflective. Beside him, the 6 cipher gears lay in a neat circle, their symbols catching the light like ancient coins. I stared at them with a kind of awe, and it still seems unbelievable, I said. All that hidden in clocks. A cipher passed down through time, pieced together like some mechanical treasure map. Poirot gave a gentle nod. It was not just a puzzle, Hastings. It was a confession. One man's sins locked behind the face of time. Quince, we, and Mallory, in his quest to decode Quince's secrets, mirrored them. He deceived his rivals, ruined his family, perhaps even blackmailed others. That ledger held more than blackmail, it held legacy. And legacy, mon ami, is a dangerous thing when placed in the wrong hands. I thought of Vera Mallory, calm and cold as steel, led away in cuffs. Of Pharaoh, wide-eyed and silent, staring at his future as though it had stopped ticking. Of Cecil Blythe returning to his dusty shop with one more regret to catalogue. Poirot, as if sensing my thoughts, reached out and turned one of the gears between his fingers. "Justice," he said quietly, "does not always strike on the hour, but it strikes nonetheless." There was a brief pause before he folded the gears back into his case and adjusted the lapels of his jacket with great satisfaction. "And now," he said, rising, "we take the train to London, where I shall clean my shoes, order 2 boxes of perfectly symmetrical macarons, and re-establish order in the world." I laughed. "No more clocks?" Poirot lifted a finger. "No more murderous clocks, Hastings, though I confess I shall always admire the precision of a fine mechanism." We left Nether Dane under a silver sky, our bags a little heavier, our steps a little slower. As we boarded the train, I glanced once over my shoulder at the village, its steeples and chimneys fading into the trees. Behind us, the clocks would keep ticking, but for Hercule Poirot, the world's finest detective, they would never quite tick the same. And so concludes the Clockmaker's Cipher, an intricate mystery unravelled by the unparalleled mind of Hercule Poirot. What did you think of the twist? Were you able to spot the clues before Poirot revealed the truth? If you enjoyed this story, give it a like, share it with your fellow sleuths, and stay tuned for more original cases featuring your favourite detectives. Until next time, keep your grey cells polished and always watch the clock.